Hey guys, it's Will from Learnerator, and in this edition of AP Micro Mondays, we're going to be walking through dominant strategy for game theory. So when you're faced with game theory questions, you're going to often be faced with a 2x2 matrix. And what this 2x2 matrix is going to look like is it's essentially going to have two boxes on the top and on the bottom. And so there's always going to be two actions, and these actions are what the players can do. And on the left-hand side is often player 1, and then on the top is oftentimes player 2. So let's go ahead and do an example. So an example may be that we want to sell a house, or we don't want to sell a house. And so the payoffs of this might be 150, 150, 250, 100, 100, 250, 300, and 300. And you may be asked on the AP Micro exam to solve for this game. So when you solve for this game, the way that you want to approach it is by thinking about what would player 1 do if we knew for sure that player 2 is going to sell. Well, let's think about this. If we cover up this region and we only consider these two payoffs of 150 and 100, player 1 is going to go ahead and sell. And then if player 2 is definitely going to not sell, then player 1 would definitely not sell as well. Now let's think about it from the perspective of player 2. If player 1 definitely sells, then player 2 is going to sell as well because 150 is greater than 100. And then if player 1 is not selling, then player 2 is also not going to sell. And so they would choose don't sell. So this has two Nash equilibriums of sell, sell, and don't sell, don't sell. And going back to the core topic of this video, we want to know, okay, are there any dominant strategies? Well, what a dominant strategy essentially says is that if I am player 1, then I will always play a certain strategy regardless of the outcome of player 2. Or if I'm player 2, I will always play the same strategy regardless of what player 1 does. And so essentially what a dominant strategy is saying is it's a strategy that always results in the highest payoff for the specific player, regardless of the other player's action. And in this situation, we see that player 1 does not have a dominant strategy. And the reason why is because if player 2 were to sell, then player 1 should sell as well. However, if player 2 were to not sell, player 1's best action would be to not sell. And therefore, there is no dominant strategy in which they will always play a certain strategy of either sell or don't sell because their action relies on player 2. And the same can be said about player 2. There's no dominant strategy. And the reason why is because player 1, if they were to sell, it makes sense for player 2 to sell. However, if player 1 were to not sell, then it also makes sense for player 2 to not sell. And so, as we can see here, there's no dominant strategy. But now let's look at the example in which there may be a dominant strategy. Okay, so now let's look at an example in which we may have a dominant strategy. Here's the case again. We have a person that's looking to sell or not sell their house. And let's first solve the game. So if we know as player 1 that player 2 is definitely going to sell, then player 1 is going to choose to sell as well because 150 is greater than 100. However, if player 2 were to not sell, then player 1 should also sell because 175 is greater than 150. Now let's solve it for player 2. If player 1 definitely sells, then player 2 is going to sell as well because 120 is greater than 100. And then if player 1 were to not sell, then player 2 would go ahead and not sell. And so now we see that we have one Nash equilibrium in this case, which is sell and sell. And if we break down the player strategies, so if we break down by player, we see that player 1 does not have, or player 1 does have a dominant strategy. And the reason why is because regardless of what player 2 does, if they sell or don't sell, player 1 is always going to sell, as we can see here. And so we have this scenario in which we have a dominant strategy because it doesn't even matter what player 2 does, player 1 is always going to sell. So sell is a dominant strategy. And then if we look at it for player 2, we see that in the case where player 1 were to sell, then player 2 would go ahead and sell. However, if player 2 were to see player 1 not selling, then they would also not sell. And therefore, we have that same situation as that first example in which we have no dominant strategy. And so that's pretty much how you approach dominant strategies. You first want to solve for the game, find the Nash equilibriums, and then observe if the player is performing a particular action regardless of the outcome of what he knows about the other player. So in the case in which the other player does a certain action and has no influence on the way that player 1 or player 2 acts, then we know that that player has a dominant strategy. So that pretty much covers it for dominant strategy. If you need additional help, feel free to check out our site or our channel where we have a more in-depth game theory video which walks through multiple examples that are actually relevant and specifically drawn from the actual AP exam. I will see you guys next time.